These lectures are titled St. Augustine's Confessions, Part 1. These lectures are titled St. Augustine's Confessions, Part 1. These lectures are titled St. Augustine's Confessions, Part 1. These lectures are titled St. Augustine's Confessions, Part 1. These lectures are titled St. Augustine's Confessions, Part 1.
Today's lesson.
What page?
Exactly 11 o'clock. Today's a young man who had to go to the only 26 years of age. Son-in-law, less than half of my age. Anyway, the COVID, another variant is strong. I can see where I really didn't want him.
The key is
I don't like to get sick.
oh well, there's nothing you can do. It's
No,
just
that's ours. Cavities. Here they're Okay, I'm going to start now. Now, as you notice, Father has a prayer. Is this on? Yes. Father has a prayer at the beginning and before Mass these days. That'll continue for some time. And we're really asked to kind of examine a lot of things about our faith. And so I would just kind of I'd like to start out here with why I am a Catholic. And a lot of times people will ask me that. And I always refer to the 6th chapter of John. So it's going to be John, 6th chapter, and verses 56 to 66. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. As the living Father sent me, I live because of the Father. So he who eats me and lives will live because of me. This is the bread which came down from heaven, not such as the fathers ate and died. He who eats this bread will live forever. This he said in the synagogue as he taught at Capernaum. Many of his disciples, when they heard it, said, "This is a hard saying. Who can listen to it?" But Jesus, knowing in himself that his disciples murmured at it, said to them, "Do you take offense at this? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending where he was before? It is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh is no avail. The words that I have spoken to you are the Spirit and life. But there are some of you that do not believe." For Jesus knew from the first who those were that did not believe, and who it was that would betray him. And he said, "This is why I told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted him by the Father." After this, many of his disciples drew back and no longer walked with him. So even here in St. John chapter 6, he who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me. That is the Eucharist. This is why we are Catholics. We are obeying God and doing what he wants us to do. We are receiving Christ when we go to Mass. Only the other group that's going to be able to, is doing this is the Orthodox Church. Nothing else. Whether it's some other religion or, our Protestant brothers and sisters. This is why I'm a Catholic. And you'll notice that after this, many of his disciples drew back and no longer walked with him. So there are people that don't accept that. Possibly even some Catholics that don't believe in the real presence. But this is why I'm a Catholic. I believe in the real presence. I believe that I am receiving Jesus when I go to the altar and receive the host from Father. And that's enough. That's all I can say. That's why I'm a Catholic. And I've always been this way for decades and decades. And you can't find this teaching right here out of the Bible. You're not going to find this in too many other churches, other religions. But we are receiving God when we receive the host. All right, now, any questions on that? You probably have your own reasons why you're a Catholic, but I think occasionally, as they say, you should live the examined life. Occasionally ask yourself why you're doing certain things, certain ways. And that's kind of why we have that little card now, because there's going to be some changes. There's going to be, obviously, some churches that are going to be closed down and others amalgamated. My biggest prayer is to have a church just like St. Mark here. Close, the handicap parking, and it's all level all the way in. I don't have to go upstairs and don't have to go downstairs. I know many years ago, I think it was Matt Ulrich asked me about being a lecturer, and I can't go. Maybe if you put railings where I can go up those stairs, but I can't do it. And so that's that. And then I think he also asked me about at that time, the blood and the chalice, and I said I can't do that because I've got kind of like Parkinson's type of problems. That's why I have to receive on the tongue, because I'm sorry. Father tried that. He says, no, I want you in the hand, and it fell down. And I can't hold on. Sorry. So there are some of us that have to receive on the tongue just for physical disability reasons. So that's why he says, and those that you have the shakes. That's what he refers to me. Okay, now chapter 9 in Ecclesiastes, where it says, acceptance of life as it comes. But all this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God. So really all of our lives are in the hands of God. We drop down to the footnote here at the bottom. 9:1, in the hand of God. Another way of saying, it will be well with those who fear God. In other words, be reverence to God. Number two, later, when a clear concept of life after death emerges in Israel's theology, God's favor and protection are said to extend beyond the grave, so that the souls of the righteous dead are likewise in the hands of God. Love or hate, ambiguous. In view of the observation made, the point may be that man cannot identify those whom God favors or loves or disfavors, hates, by observing the prosperity or adversity they experience in the world. On the other hand, love and hate are connected with human rather than divine actions. Yeah, that was kind of an old teaching or belief anyway, especially by the Sadducees, that depending on how wealthy you are or poor, that was chosen by God. Calvin had the same kind of belief too, with his predestination beliefs. But again, you go back to the Scripture. It's not the flesh. It's not these material things that count in life, but it's the spiritual life. And it's more important than actually the fleshly life. In the Old Testament also, that's the story about the rich man and the poor man outside. And when they both die, the poor man, of course, winds up in the better portion of the bosom of Abraham, and the rich man is destined to a life of misery. And he objects, but he's told, listen, you had the choice in life. You could have listened to Moses, but you didn't. So there you have it. So accept your lot in life, where you are, and try to improve it all the time with that examination of your conscience at night. Go through what you've done, what you failed to do, and how to correct it, and live a better life. It's difficult at times. There's also lots of crazy things going on in your life. There's other people that are not so nice. But that's it. I could remember there was a lot of bad things said to me because I was a faithful child. I loved the old Mass. I was a choir boy. And I even continued that later on whenever anybody needed, because there was a period of time when if most of their life they had spent listening or participating in the Latin Mass, for their funeral Mass they had the choice of the old Latin Mass. And I used to be called back to do that along with a few other people. But I got some really nasty... When people found out what I was doing, I just, I was always in favor of, a reverent Mass, and I was not one of these things where you're jumping up and down and playing the guitar, and that just, I never understood that. Unfortunately, we're coming back to, I think, a lot of more reverential worship these days. It's getting better all the time. So maybe I was right after all. Okay, now, moving on to verse 5. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward. That's verse 5 on page 78 here. So really, only with the knowledge of the living under the sun, in other words, those that have passed away, they have, we're going to go down to the footnote here, 9:5, the dead know nothing. In view of death, in which the deceased are no longer capable of thinking, acting, or experiencing joys of any kind. Moreover, they are quickly forgotten by the living. According to this view, the state of death barely qualifies as existence at all. Koheleth is either adopting the common view of his times or engaging in his own speculation about the state of death. Either way, his inspired works reveal the limits of reason rather than the actual circumstances attending the souls of the departed. It is only with the deposit of Christian revelation that we learn of the full truth about what happens to man after death, particular and universal judgments, resurrection of the body, heaven and hell, so forth. And that's from the Catholic Catechism. So now we have a much fuller view of what happens after death than the time here of Ecclesiastes. It's kind of an ongoing revelation over time, starting with Adam and Eve and going through Noah and so forth and on up until eventually you get to Jesus, the final revelation and the New Testament. And that leads us to, again, the way we need to live, because we know that we're only going to be here for anywhere from 60 to 80, maybe to 90 years of age. But in heaven, for eternity. So, and that's what counts, is getting to heaven and living eternally. Footnote number 11. Again, I saw that under the sun, that means here on earth, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to the men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. So in other words, that's kind of a deterministic type of a view where we're all sort of like victims of chance. But now going to the footnote here on 9:11, where it says is not, means is not always or is not necessarily time and chance. The reason for success and failure in the time and chance, the reason for the success and failure in life are sometimes elusive and even contrary to speculation. The instances noted in this verse show that the wise action and thinking are not guarantees of a desired outcome, because sometimes events are beyond human control. The ultimate factor to be reckoned with is God's providence, which determines time of everything. And so a lot of times when you're going through pain, sickness, COVID, leave it up to God, just entrust in God. Don't, in a lot of problems in life, don't take a lot of anxiety into yourself. God's not going to give you anything that you can't succeed in and overcome. I think a lot of people, as the old saying goes, worry about a lot of things that never happen. So, and no, we're not victims of chance or circumstance, because I know there's a French mathematician, Duhem, D-U-H-E-M, who pointed out that the fact that I'm here with a microphone talking to you and you more or less understanding what I'm saying is next to impossible. Mathematically, it's not going to happen by chance. There has to be a divine inspiration behind all of this. Even the great Albert Einstein pointed out that God does not play craps with the universe. In other words, he's not throwing things out just chance that we're going to wind up, where we are and how we are, with, the right amount of oxygen, the right amount of heat, the ability to speak, gravity existing, and many, many other things. It's just beyond human and even inhuman calculation. So trust in God always. Okay, now in chapter 10 here, where it's observations of wisdom, verse number 5. There is an even evil which I have seen under the sun, in other words, on earth here, as it were an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses and princes walking on foot like slaves. In other words, sometimes things are just upside down in life. And going to the verse here in the footnote, I always refer to the footnote because this is, Scott Hahn, and it's there's an imprimatur. So it's certified by the Catholic Church. In other words, this is not my ideas. Imprimatur, yes. I'll get the words right. Okay, 10:5-7. Folly turns the world upside down and brings the evil of a disordered society and government. In the words of Proverbs, it is not fitting to honor fools and slaves with a promotion to the royal court in the place of rightful kings, princes, and so forth. So sometimes, you just don't understand, well, why in the world did that guy ever wind up to be president or something like that? Well, he had an undying ambition. A lot of us would, I would never even consider really running for political office myself. I recently read a book online. I think you can get it at your stores too, by Trey Gowdy, on making, right decisions and all that in life. And he got out of Congress because he said it was just a swamp, where basically immoral acts go on daily, at one after another. And I can, you kind of understand that. I know even I work, of course, for the city of Linwood and at the sewage treatment plant, and people tell me, well, you're down there at the treatment. You'd be surprised how rarely, if ever, the city council ever talks about the sewage treatment plant or the water facility or many of the other, things, because work in the utilities department. On the other hand, they discuss things that are just very political, items. Like sexual identity and things like that. That to me, what? Why even discuss some nonsense like that? But they do. That's politics. And yes, go ahead. Yeah, okay. Karen's talking about, a person from that, where she used to live in the Crescent City that went down to, Sacramento there. And, well, 50 years. Things never change. This is why this country originally was founded on very limited government, and also why they chose Washington, D.C. to locate the nation's capital, because at the time it was a swamp, and they figured that you'd never have, it wasn't like Philadelphia or New York. You had large established cities and all that, and they wanted things to slowly done, if at all. What counted was what you do locally, But I don't want to get into politics at all. But it does seep in. And it mentioned several times here in the Old Testament about sometimes things being totally upside down, and you have a lot of evil kings, and that tends to breed paganism, idolatry, and a lot of other things. And so you have these ups and downs with Israeli history, and the Old and New Testament. That's one of the factors. It is history as well. I mean, it's and the divine hand behind that history. A lot of other religions don't really get into history that much or in that great depth. Okay, so in other words, you do need to bring wisdom to work to succeed, and you don't want to waste your time on the speculation on a lot of nonsense. Number 14, a fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? In the footnote down here, a fool multiplies his words. Excessive speech is a mark of foolishness, just as guarded speech is an exercise of wisdom. No man knows. Koheleth again acknowledges the limitations of human intelligence, which is unable to see the future. So, for example, where I work with a lot of young people, some of whom, I'm even older than their grandparents, and they're always talking about football this time of year. And they listen to these people on various radio shows, I guess, talk. ESPN, I think it's called. And I can remember at one weekend not too long ago where the Detroit Lions were going to be playing the Green Bay Packers, and all these speculators were saying, how Green Bay is just going to mop the field, that Detroit has no chance whatsoever. And I felt, well, anything can happen any given Sunday. And sure enough, the Detroit Tigers beat the Packers. So all these guys were totally wrong. But would they admit it next week? No. They were off onto some other speculation. So there's a lot of wasted talk in life. Now, one of the more dangerous statements here comes in verse 18 and 19. Through sloth the roof sinks in, and through indolence the house leaks. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. Well, we'll get down to here in the footnote, money answers everything. The meaning of this remark is debated. It has been read as a sarcastic comment, as a mere observation about the pleasures money can buy, and as a recommendation to earn one's life by hard work, in contrast to laziness mentioned in above about laziness. Now, there's two things two tracks, I guess. When you talk about money answers everything, that is a very common view on people down here on earth or under the sun, where they believe, well, the answer to poverty is to give everybody money. Like that's going to solve everything. You'll find even in the worst ghettos, there are some people that live very good lives, very saintly lives. And there's others that, will join a gang and rack heaven or, hell on a lot of the other people in that community. I know in Chicago, I think it's 700 people die a year, and that's not counting just the wounded. So there's that view of money answers everything. It's a lot of people that just let's raise the minimum wage or whatever. It all has to do with they think it's just strictly money, as opposed to good education and developing skills to overcome a poorer life. A another way to look at this is young people, I know, I'm sure, at our school over here are taught about a life of service, of good service. And in any business, the reason you want to have your people give good service to the customers, to use a quote from Warren Buffett, you want to delight the customer. Because if you are very good to the customers that come through the door, you'll get repeat and repeat business over time, and that brings in money to the company. In other words, money is going to help out people that give good service. On the other hand, I think we've all experienced where we've gone into some store or bought something that is a piece of you know what and just doesn't work, and maybe, or you've gone to some store where the service is horrible. So you never go back. I know there's one particular restaurant that, and it's a chain that I went to many, many decades ago, and I got food poisoning, and I've never, ever gone back to any one of their chain stores, and probably never will, because I was in really a bad way for a week or so. I can remember when I called up the, I did live. God will get you through. Yes, God will get you through. And I can remember when the health department called me up, because you know, I had to see my doctor first. Then the health department called me up and wanted to know where I got this, and I told them where I went and what I ate, and he said, "Oh, you're number 16 today." So that particular one got shut down, but on the other hand, like I say, it was a chain, and I think they're still going. I don't know. And I know of a lot of other people, young people, that have gotten fecal coliform poisoning from another chain. And I've never gone to one of those places either, for that matter. But that's one good lesson that, especially if there's young people listening to this talk here today, that it's important, whether or not you have personal problems or you don't like where you're working, put a good face on. Be nice, be of good service. If you don't like the job, then on the side, maybe look for work elsewhere. But that's very important, a lesson to learn, that if you're nice to other people, they're going to be attracted to you. And like I say, that repeat business, that's what counts. Not somebody coming in and getting gouged or whatever, because they're not going to come back. So a life of service is very important in business and in faith. And I know when I was in St. Vincent de Paul many times, I would bring in maybe some food or something like that, maybe help them out with their rent. And they would ask me why, and I said, because God has told us to love God with all our heart, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And you are living in St. Mark Parish, and you are our neighbor. And this is why we are helping you out. And please visit St. Mark anytime. Monday through Friday, it's usually going to be open, regular business hours, and you'll go in and see this beautiful tapestry in the back end of the church. You'll be amazed. It's gorgeous. And there are many other things inside too. It's worth the trip, especially in the summertime when the flowers and the bloom are in bloom and everything. And the flower, there's always flowers in the church, and they're gorgeous too. It's worth your trip. And if Mass is going, just sit in the back, because that's usually where I sit anyway. So, yeah, you're more than well. And they will always usually ask, well, what else can I do? And I said, well, you could also pray for us too. That works. It really helps, because people have given me the food and the money. This is not mine, but it's the people from St. Mark that have helped me out to be able to bring these things to you. So they're very good people, and keep them in your prayers. Okay, now we move on to chapter 11. The value of diligent. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you do not know what evil happens on earth. Okay, now we go down to the footnotes again, and to 11:1-2. The subject of these verses is disputed. They are either about charitable giving or commercial trading, if the former. One is urged to be generous in almsgiving, assisting as many people as possible, aware that blessings may eventually return to the giver. If the latter, one is advised to launch a business venture abroad, being careful to diversify one's investments so as to minimize losses and to increase the chances of making a profit. Both these readings presuppose that life entails a certain amount of risk in the face of an uncertain future. And I think both of those are true, because even with my work with St. Vincent de Paul, eventually there were a couple of cases where people actually came to the church and went through RCA and became Catholics and joined the church, and then in both the cases, then they moved elsewhere, but they remained faithful Catholics for the rest of their lives. So things like that do happen. We do get converts that way, and many other ways too that God only knows. But He does bring people into the church. It's God that does the converting, not us. But we kind of help out in God's plans. And then the other one about commercial ways of looking at this. I know, for example, these days a lot of normal pensions are no longer given out. You've got 401(k)(3)Bs and many other ways of investing for your retirement. And I personally have kind of have decided to buy a few stocks here and there. And it's best to diversify. I tend to go for the larger stocks that have good dividends. And I've done well with a couple of them. I know when the banking industry was kind of hit hard in 2008 and 9, and Bank of America was selling for about $12 a share. And as a youngster, I had my money for my paper route. I used to put it in Seattle First National, which eventually got bought out by Bank of America. So anyway, I bought a lot of Bank of America, and now it's selling for $30 to $40. So I've made a lot there. On the other hand, there's a couple of other ones that I bought, such as Intel, with Matt knows, and Verizon. Now, they both pay very good dividends, but both of them have gone down. And Intel keeps on sinking. I know we need microchips, but whether it's just it's not competing very well or it's a bad market, I don't know. But so I'm not a genius on everything. But the fact that I've done very well with Bank of America and Crown and Castle. Crown and Castle is the ones that make those repeating towers, that people always complain about in their communities. But I figured, well, with cell phones and all that, they need those towers, and it's gone way up. So I've had some winners and I have some losers, but it's best to diversify because I don't know which ones are going to do well and which aren't. I'm not, as Bernard Baruch pointed out, those that if there's somebody that says that they can predict the high of the market and the low of the market, that person is a liar. That you can't predict all the time, or even most of the time, for that matter. Okay, so verse 4 here. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. As you do not know how the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with a child. I want to repeat that again. How you do not know how the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. You know, we're still debating that today. It's about when does life begin? And there's those that think that abortion is allowed any time, that it's not really a child or a human, it's just a blob of cells. And those of us that, at conception, that's a child, because humans produce humans. They might be a little bit deformed like I am, but we're still human and in the image of God. So this is kind of an item here that is still going on. I mean, Ecclesiastes was written well before the time of Christ, and that's still the whole business about childbirth and when is a child, and all that is still under discussion. And so anyway, that's a topic here that 11:4, he who observes. The farmer who waits for the perfect weather symbolizes the person who misses opportunities in life because of his failure to act. I know, now I also own about 78 acres of farmland, and there are a lot of times in the early spring where everything gets wiped out because of very heavy floods. I always tell them, just reseed, and it works out. That, if I had just left it and had given up, I wouldn't make anything. But these days, I mean, you can see the price of everything in the stores going way up. And that helps me. I'm making more money off of that farm than I ever have had because the prices of commodities, corn and wheat and soybeans and sorghum and everything, you can imagine as the prices have gone way up. And also technology has improved too on better seeds and better fertilizers and things like that. And so I think it's there are a lot of fewer farms. There's a lot fewer farmers, but we're actually producing more in this country. And that's due to technology too. Even in farming, technology has made some great with bio research into plants and really helped a lot. So you need to keep up with the times. Knowledge helps you out. And sometimes, you need to know when to act. And I've always planted, and even when they tell me not to, and it's always worked out for me. Moving on to page 80 now, verse 9. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. So eventually, you always, even a young person, you got to think in the long term, in the long run, about your life. Where it says, 9, in the footnotes here, 11:9, rejoice in your youth. Encouragement to squeeze the most out of life while one is still in prime judgment. The reminder that God will hold each person accountable for his deeds tempers the summons to youthful enjoyment, lest it be taken as a license for overindulgence. So always remember that in the end times, when for each of us to again think about what have you done, what deeds have you done that are, that between the sheep and the goats. When have you helped the poor? When have you helped the naked? When have you fed the hungry? And so forth. And also going to Mass, too, and receiving Holy Eucharist. Big item. Okay, now we have chapter 12, Advice to the Young. Verse 2. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after rain, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men are bent, and so forth. And we go down to the footnotes where it says darkened, 12 colon 2, darkened. Cosmic darkness is a common theme in prophetic visions of God judging the world. Remember the Creator by thinking and turning toward Him before the sun is darkened, that is, before Christ, the Son of Justice, is darkened by a loss of faith, and before light is darkened, that is, before one loses love and thereby loses grace. Well, now the way I look at this about the darkening is what happened on the crucifix. There was an eclipse, there was darkness, and then all of a sudden, of course, there were a lot of those that had passed away were walking the streets of Jerusalem. So always remember that even though there are times of darkness, there are going to be times of light, and after that, there's going to be Christ's resurrection and our resurrection too. Christ showed us the way to heaven. And we have verse 7. And the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God. In other words, life, dust to dust and all that. It says when we pass away, 12:7, dust. Biblical imagery for the substance of the mortal body that dissolves into the ground after death. The spirit, the breath of that animates the human body but departs at death. Well, we're going to be raised in a glorified body. It's not going to be what I've got now. So that's always remember that when you pass away, it's going to be your spirit and a glorified body, just like Christ, when he rose, was in a glorified body. Now, note 11, the sayings of the wise are like goads. Goads are a sharp thing to get the cattle moving, a very sharp point. And like nails firmly fixed are collected sayings which are given by one shepherd. My son, beware of anything beyond these, of making many books there is no end, and such much study is a weariness of the flesh. The end of the matter all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Now, where it says 12:13, fear God. Reverence for God is the primary religious virtue urged in this book, and is a classic teaching associated with Solomon. It is a duty that includes faithful observance of the Torah, a link made in the book of Sirach. With the statement, fear God, the preacher ceases to be perplexed. This alone is profitable for your present life, to be taken through the confusion of things visible and unstable to things that are solid and immovable. So in other words, you need to lift your eyes above the sun, ask to be remade in Christ every day. In 2 Corinthians 4:16-18, therefore do not lose heart, though Outwardly, we are wasting away, yet inwardly, we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweigh them all. And with that, I'm ready for, it is 11 o'clock, and yes, Matt.
Before we, I push the
Yes.
was on sale for about $7.
They've already been bought. I have about at least 15 copies of Job.
I'm sorry,
Oh, that's all right. That's all right.
just to let you know,
Matt was pointing out that the book of Job can, like these books, can be bought for $7 on Amazon.
you must have done it.
That's right. Yes. Okay, we're ready. If we can get number 2.
Push the button.
Here we go. Let's see. Can we get it louder?
In Lecture 2, we're beginning to narrow the scope from where we were in Lecture 1. Lecture 1 was the big overview. In this talk, we're going to focus more on the political and religious events of Augustine's time. In Lecture 3, then, we're going to move on to still more focus as we prepare to actually turn to the text of Confessions. We pointed out in the last lecture that Augustine was a Roman. He was a native Latin speaker. He was born inside the Roman Empire in a town called Thagaste in North Africa in the modern nation of Algeria. What I would want to emphasize is that to us, that sounds like he's on the periphery of things. Because after all, today North Africa is a very different place than Europe. But let's remember, the center of the Roman world was not Europe. The center of the Roman world was the Mediterranean. And therefore, in a real sense, the closer you lived to the Mediterranean, the more thoroughly Romanized you were. And hence, not only was Augustine a Roman, he was probably more culturally Romanized than Roman citizens born, let's say, in Paris or London or York or Trier in northern Germany. And therefore, we need never to forget, among the many other things, the Romanness of Augustine.
Yeah, I would make 2 points just to add to what Bill said. One is to emphasize the fact that sometimes we get this sense as moderns that Augustine wasn't really a Roman, or he only became one when later in his life he traveled to Italy and lived in Rome and lived in Milan and so on. Not at all. He was part of that Roman culture right from the beginning. But the second point that I would make is that that culture, of course, was a kind of combination, a kind of synthesis of Roman ideas and native ideas as well. So that, just to take one example, scholars have pointed out that the name of Augustine's mother, Monica, a person who in fact is a very important character in the Confessions, is not a Roman name, and therefore she may have been of Berber origin. And so to say that he was Roman doesn't exclude other influences. It's rather another way to say that Rome was a kind of syncretistic empire. It took things and put them together and did that pretty well. But of course, the point to emphasize is that by education, by culture, and by habit, Augustine was as Roman as they came. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting about that is that Rome itself, that is to say the idea of the Roman Empire, was facing all kinds of new challenges during this time as well. It wasn't simply within the Christian tradition that enormous changes were taking place, and Augustine's Romanness reflects this.
The 2-minute review of Roman history goes something like this. In the first couple centuries of the Common Era, the Roman Empire worked pretty well. And even though there were a couple goofy emperors along the way and so on, by and large, at one point in the 2nd century, the Roman Empire reached from the Irish Sea to the Persian Gulf. And the great historian Edward Gibbon of the Roman Empire talked about the 2nd century as perhaps the best century of all time in which to live. However, the 3rd century in the Common Era was an era of chaos. Emperor after emperor after emperor, disease, Germanic invasion, all kinds of things. In fact, Rome actually had its first set of walls built around the year 285. But then came along two great reforming emperors back to back, Diocletian and Constantine. Of course, in religion, they were very different because Diocletian persecuted Christians and Constantine became a Christian. But in many ways, in terms of how to administer the empire, they agreed. They made a number of changes. Perhaps for us, the most important change was to divide the Roman Empire roughly into two large administrative districts that we would call the West and the East. And the idea was there'd be an emperor in each half, but that one emperor would be sort of higher than the other emperor. Well, you can imagine how well that worked over time. First of all, there was no great Roman succession, no obvious way of choosing who the next emperor was, and you can imagine how uncomfortable either of the Roman emperors would be in being Roman emperor number 2. And therefore, what we have is a situation in the 4th century where there is a lot of political conflict, not just because of invaders coming from the outside, but also within the empire, between the two halves, between pretender emperors and real emperors, between Western emperor and Eastern emperor. It was a time of change. It was a time of tension. It was a time sometimes of great violence within the confines of the Roman Empire.
Should also add to that the split between East and West was not simply political, but was cultural as well, which is to say the Western half Latin-speaking, the Eastern half Greek-speaking. Well, it's very interesting to take a look at that split in terms of Augustine himself, because one of the things that he tells us in the Confessions was that he never really did get very good at Greek. And the thing that's sort of interesting about that, from the point of view of the history of Christianity, is that up until the time of Augustine, most of the serious theological reflection followed the fact that Scripture itself was written in Greek. It was written in Greek. And Augustine is in a kind of newer tradition doing this in Latin. And the fact that he is the greatest of the Latin fathers is not something that would have been as evident in his own time as it has become retrospectively in history. The fact is that by doing what he did in Latin, he has changed the course of history in very important ways.
Let's also remember that in addition to these conflicts taking place inside the Roman Empire, as Ron suggested, in some ways cultural conflicts as well as political conflicts, we have another layer of problem. And that is especially in the second half of the 4th century. Again, remember Augustine's born in 354. Right then when Augustine is growing up, if you will, we have serious Germanic invasions of Goths and other tribes into the Roman Empire. How serious? In 378, one of the Roman emperors was killed by a Germanic army in a battle that obviously the Roman Empire lost. And therefore, although we tend to think of it as the guys in the horned helmets with the spears that sort of look like Hagar the Horrible coming to invade Europe, that's not a very good way of looking at it. Nevertheless, the Germanic threat is a very important one. And let me suggest two ways in which the invasion of the Germans into the Roman Empire directly affect Augustine. One is that when the Germans came, they didn't stop in the European part of the Roman Empire. They, in fact, crossed over into Africa. And when Augustine was on his deathbed in Hippo in 430, a Germanic tribe with the charming name of the Vandals were actually besieging the city of Hippo, and within a few months of Augustine's death, they had captured the city of Hippo. A second issue with the Germans is that because the Germans were coming from the north into the empire, the emperor actually sort of moved his place of residence from Rome further north to where he was closer to the front line. And the place he moved to was Milan. And therefore, as we will read in the Confessions, when Augustine goes to Italy, he goes first to Rome, but then he moves to Milan. That might seem like he's moving away from the center of Roman power, but in fact he's moving to it because the emperor at that time is resident in Milan, and therefore the bishop that so influences Augustine, and also, I might add, baptizes Augustine, Ambrose, is also, in a sense, the emperor's bishop, the one that the emperor hears preaching on a Sunday morning in the Cathedral of Milan. So in a couple different ways, even those obscure things that we associate with the Middle Ages, the Germanic invasions into Europe, affected the life of St. Augustine.
One other Augustinian footnote to these events. I mean, we'll see in the Confessions later on that when he does travel to Italy, Rome and Milan turn out to be the key cities where he spends time. But in addition to that, it's important for us to realize that these events found their way into his writings in other ways as well. What some would consider his most monumental work, The City of God, certainly is the longest, going well over 1,000 pages in a modern edition, was written as a response to a particular event, the fact that the Goths, another tribe with a charming name, turned out to sack Rome itself in the year 410. And this event, I mean, again, it would be hard to think about an event with comparable significance in terms of the way it kind of turned everybody's ideas upside down. And here was Rome, had lasted forever, and now all of a sudden it looked strangely vulnerable. This brought forth an awful lot of anguish and anguished writing, trying to figure out what was this all about. Augustine's entry into the field was The City of God, written in direct response to that particular cataclysm.
So in a number of ways, we need to set this political and even military context for Augustine. Now, let's turn to perhaps even a more immediately important context, and that is something we want to dwell on more detail than we did in the first lecture. What were the basic arguments, conflicts, discussions among Christians in Augustine's time? Because even though Augustine will not in the Confessions tick them off and say, well, let me respond to this one and this one and this one, in fact, he does that. And the more we know of this background of what the debates of the day are, the more subtly we can read the Confessions of St. Augustine. And I suppose the place to begin was what was the burning issue in the first, and it somewhat continued in the second half of the 4th century, and that was the issue over the nature of Christ. And here is, in a sense, the issue in a nutshell. Is Christ God, or is Christ the first thing that God created? Now, sometimes today, even to people who go to church every Sunday, these seem like rather obscure issues that don't have anything to do with living out the Christian faith. But perhaps it seems that way to us only because a long time ago they ultimately got settled. But the issue is the first thing of creation or part of Creator. And the conflict developed in North Africa, in the eastern part of North Africa, in Egypt, between those who said Jesus is in fact part of God, and a priest from Alexandria named Arius who said there was a time when Christ was not. He's the first thing that God created. And that led, among other things, to the first ecumenical council, the first worldwide council of bishops, which was held in 325, again, just about a quarter of a century before Augustine was born.
The ideas of Arius, oddly enough, came to be known as Arianism. They were, as Bill said, condemned at the first 2 ecumenical councils, and the other position was the position that turned out to be the Orthodox one. But we need to remember that all of this is a lot easier to see in hindsight, both because of the fact that theologically there were an awful lot of heavy hitters on both sides, and because the political ramifications were such that at certain times in history, the Arians were in the lead. Okay, there were more of them and they were more powerful. And so it's important to keep that in mind when we sort of look at this. Again, as Bill said, it's hard for us to get worked up over this, but it was a burning issue in Augustine's time, especially because some of the folks who moved to North Africa turned out to hold Arian positions, and there were particularly bitter disputes here. And again, to kind of piggyback on something that Bill said before, one of the important issues is to realize that Augustine couldn't help but write on these in other works. In other words, in the Confessions, we're going to see some of this indirectly. It's going to be important in terms of the background and the context. But other works, he sort of takes on these heretical movements very directly. And we have to keep in mind that in a very real sense, he had no choice but to do this in his position as bishop. That is to say, in his position as leader of the Christian flock, he had to guide, he had to direct, he had to teach. That was part of his priestly office. So that Augustine writes on all of these issues with great frequency in the course of his career.
Let me just illustrate a couple ways in which this Arian question is present in Augustine's time. One of the great works he wrote that we're not going to discuss, even in the next lecture that looks at the corpus of the works of St. Augustine, is a work on the Trinity. Well, there is no Trinity if Jesus isn't God. That is to say, that Christian concept of Trinity doesn't make any sense apart from the rejection of the Arian position. And so whenever we see Augustine in the Confessions invoking Christ, Christ the human, Christ the God, we need to be aware that in some way, directly or indirectly, consciously or just subconsciously, he is reflecting on this debate that is still going on despite the condemnation of the Arians in 325. A second, more practical thing, although Augustine probably didn't think a great deal about this, he would have known about it. Those Vandals who were closing in on Hippo at the time Augustine died were Arian Christians. In other words, Arianism spread to several of the Germanic tribes, and therefore when they invaded into the Roman Empire, they not only were a military problem, they were a religious problem. And therefore we don't want to forget that, even though that's not going to be a primary focus of Augustine, that Arianism, which gradually seemed to be dying in the Roman Empire in the late 4th and 5th centuries, it was condemned a second time in 381 by bishops, nevertheless got new life because the very Germans who sacked Rome, the very Germans who took the city of Hippo shortly after Augustine's death, were in fact Arian Christians.
If the Arian controversy is about the question of who Jesus is, the second question that we want to deal with briefly in this lecture is a question about what is the nature of the church. And the dispute that arises about the nature of the church turns out to have just as strong and just as important consequences as Arianism. The name that we give to this dispute is called Donatism, again named after Donatus, who is the most, who expounded the position, and it too had been condemned early, but remained very powerful for reasons that we'll show it right now. Here's the deal. There were an awful lot of reasons why one might want to give up one's Christianity in the face of persecution. It had been something, of course, that Christians had to face throughout their history. But now, all of a sudden, you have to deal with the question, what happens when Christianity kind of rebounds in a particular area where the threat, where the the danger of death isn't there anymore? You used to be a priest, but you say, well, give that stuff up because it's much better to go back to being a pagan than, say, like being fed to a lion. But then there's no threat anymore, and you go back and you want to kind of take over your position as priest or bishop again.
So the larger issue, to take what Ron said as a specific, the larger issue is, A, are leaders by virtue of their virtue? That is to say, to be a legitimate bishop, do you have to be a good guy in addition to having been consecrated? And that's a really important question, because there were some bishops who gave up and surrendered essentially to the Romans when the Romans knocked on the door and said, hand us your books and swear to pagan gods. And so when in North Africa is where Donatism developed, when after the persecution those guys said, okay, now I want my bishopric back, that brought about a conflict. And again, the way it was phrased is, well, if these guys are bad guys, if they're going to hell because of the fact they abandoned the faith when there was trouble, doesn't that mean they're not really bishops? And therefore, doesn't that mean, think about what the logic of this is, if they're not bishops, then the people that they gave communion to didn't take communion, the people they ordained as priests aren't priests, and so on and so forth. So that there was a belief, the Donatist belief, that your ability to hold office was deeply rooted in and dependent upon your moral state. And the position that won out eventually, the position that was the Orthodox position, is that no, it's by virtue of the office you hold. You may go to hell, but your character doesn't impede the validity of what you do if you've been legitimately consecrated. North Africa was the battleground of this, and Augustine had to deal with this one directly because, in fact, we sometimes forget about this, in all the cities of North Africa, that would include Hippo, that would include Augustine's hometown of Thagaste, there was a Donatist church and there was a Catholic church. And they might have even had roughly equal numbers of members. In other words, this was a real-life, day-to-day, walk-down-the-street kind of issue for Augustine, as well as a theological issue for Augustine.
It's important to think about some of the logical consequences of the fact that the Orthodox position won out. One is that if, in fact, you accepted Donatist belief and said that a person is has to be a person of virtue, problem with that is you don't always know. That a person's spiritual state is something that is not apparent, and it's also something that is, by golly, possible to fake. So that there would be enormous theological problems if you're always sort of worried about whether or not the person administering the rites of the Christian church were people of virtue or not. It would be ultimately a real mess. Equally important, it kind of gave a definition to what the church really turns out to be. Is this an organization of the holy and only the holy? Is it only for the sanctified, or is it better to look at the church as a kind of hospital for sinners, a kind of spiritual hospital that helps us on the road to salvation, allows us to get better, but is there welcoming saints and sinners alike? And again, since this was the Orthodox position, or rather, this was the logic that comes from the Orthodox position, it's important to keep in mind that it provides ultimately a much more inclusive idea of what the church, of what the Christian community is all about. And notice, of course, that that ties into the issue of the fact that the Christian community is getting ever larger and larger and larger, that it's now reached the point where it is a world religion.
And Augustine is a bishop with pastoral responsibilities, and the fact that he is Orthodox, not Donatist, on this issue says what kind of a community he envisions himself being the pastor of and what his jobs are. Let's just give a couple illustrations of some of the practical problems. One of the great facts of history is that although Constantine favored Christianity for a long, long time as emperor, he was only baptized on his deathbed. That seems like a very odd story to us, but I think we can ask why. Well, baptism washes you clean of sin, and therefore, why not wait till I really can't sin anymore to be washed clean, because I can only be baptized once. And so adult baptism, which is what we read about in New Testament scriptures, adult baptism was the norm in the early church. There was even a separate part of early churches where those who were preparing for baptism could stand and look in on the services before they were allowed in upon their baptism. So one of the issues of this inclusion is the issue of, well, do you baptize an infant? And Augustine was one of the very important supporters of infant baptism. Another issue is, how do you, if you do sin following baptism, get back to even? How do you get cleansed of sin since you can't be baptized again? And so we are living in a time period in which that question is being asked in new ways. As infant baptism and, as Ron said, large Christian population are now becoming the norms, how do we reconcile people, not just keep them in the church, but bring them back in after they've done something, even something fairly heinous? And Augustine and Augustine's baptizer, Ambrose, are both important figures in the Christian tradition in dealing with this issue.
Bill had mentioned a little earlier that the two emperors most responsible for the reorganization of the empire were Diocletian and Constantine. Let's take a look at those two folks from the religious point of view now and come back to something that we've been kind of hinting at in a number of different ways, namely that before Constantine, Christianity had been a minority persecuted religion, and afterwards it is a favored religion within the empire. What we want to suggest, in other words, is some of the ways in which Constantine and his conversion to Christianity turned out to change the relationship between what we would now call church and state within the empire. Constantine, for one thing, legislates so that Christianity now is favored. Well, let's think about what the implications of that might be. One thing that happens, of course, is that in the previous quote-unquote administration under under Emperor Diocletian, what happens is that if they knock on the door taking the census and say, you know, religious preference, and you say Christian, they say, ah, well, there is an empty slot in the 3 o'clock feeding of the lions. Why don't you come down and be lunch for some rather large cats that we have down there? A generation later, that same census taker would say, Christian, ah, good, because the emperor is looking for people of your persuasion. There are some jobs that he wants to fill with some good Christian folk, and what that means is that now, all of a sudden, you not only are not persecuted, you have a kind of favored, privileged status within the empire. Well, all kinds of things change when that changes. What it means, of course, is that the church gets powerful, and it also means that the church gets wealthy. These were two things that were new in the history of Christianity and were, by definition, very, very interesting and very, very difficult to handle.
If one goes to Rome today, what we discover is that there are a lot of great big old churches, but the earliest of them date from the 4th century. Because A, you needed big buildings for a lot of people, but B, the church began to get the wealth to build those buildings. In fact, the first of those big churches in Rome was attached to a palace that had belonged to Constantine that he gave to the Bishop of Rome when Constantine moved to Constantinople. And so we begin to see the good side of the church gaining some wealth, that is to say, big places to assemble, the bishop living in a decent place, the art that decorates those buildings that explain Christianity to people in a variety of ways. All those things seem good to us, and we celebrate those monuments today. But also, the church and its bishops, not just the Bishop of Rome, but all bishops, began to get certain kinds of authority, some of which are pretty close to being quasi-governmental authority because the emperor is comfortable trusting bishops with certain kinds of jobs that didn't belong to religious officials up to this time. So in a number of ways, what we would call church and state, it's something of an anachronism, but what we would call church and state are growing close, not only closer together, but we begin to get a little bit of overlapping and interpenetration, if you will, in ways that, well, we know in the 21st century, we're still sorting out those kinds of relationships, even though in somewhat different terms than they were in the 4th century.
Let's talk a little bit about those kinds of overlapping for a minute. One thing, of course, is that it meant that because the empire was clearly implicated in this Christianity business, emperors, Constantine certainly among them, were pretty eager to give what we would think of now as specifically religious advice to the church. Another thing that's very interesting is the way in which the Christians' sense of war and fighting changed. It seems to be the case that Christianity in its earliest years was pacifist in its orientation, which would certainly follow from a reading of the Gospels. And it was, I guess, easier to, one way to look at it is a lot easier to refuse to fight in the emperor's armies when the emperor was a pagan and when there was persecution going around anyhow. But what happens once the emperor is a Christian? Well, one of the things that we find is that Christians begin to serve in the army. And a defense of the empire also, in a very real way, becomes a defense of Christianity. Well, that brings with it enormous complications and enormous problems. And it certainly is worth mentioning at this point that Augustine was one of the thinkers who dealt with that particular issue, because Augustine began to speak very eloquently about conditions under which Christians could fight. And again, we see the way in which the larger context is important in terms of what it is that Augustine is actually writing about.
Even today, in articles that appear in popular magazines every now and then, especially if America is at war or preparing for war, there'll be articles about Christian just war theory. And wherever that is, in Time or Newsweek or whatever, virtually always they start with St. Augustine, that he is, in a sense, the key Christian figure in developing a theory, often misunderstood, I might add, but nevertheless a theory of just war. It's another reminder of the time in which Augustine lived. This is really a new question for Christians because it's a new reality in which they're living with an emperor that not only goes to war, but worships next to you on Sunday morning. And that's not a situation the early Christians had to deal with at all.
So to sort of summarize this lecture, it's important for us to remember and keep in mind as we're going through the text of the Confessions that Augustine grew to adulthood and converted to Christianity in the most dynamic century of Christian history, and that is going to be reflected in the text of the Confessions. There's a guy named Pisidius